King Charles has been in Kenya this week, and he's been trying to make amends for Britain's colonial crimes.
It is the intimacy of our shared history that has brought our people together. However, we must also acknowledge the most difficult times of our long and complex relationship. The wrongdoings of the past are a cause of the greatest sorrow and the deepest regret. There were abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans as they waged, as you said at the United Nations, a painful struggle for independence and sovereignty. And for that, there can be no excuse. In coming back to Kenya, it matters greatly to me that I should deepen my own understanding of these wrongs, and that I meet some of those whose lives and communities were so grievously affected. None of this can change the past, but by addressing our history with honesty and openness, we can perhaps demonstrate the strength of our friendship today.
So the news here is that King Charles didn't offer quite an apology, but he did express regret about Britain's past. And we should talk about what Britain's past in Kenya is. Britain began colonising the land that would become Kenya from 1888, and British authorities would go on to forcibly take land, pen the native population in reserves, introduce forced labour, and commit all of the other injustices associated with colonialism. But specifically, King Charles was referencing Britain's response to the Mau Mau uprising. The Mau Mau, formerly called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, were a militant group that fought British rule throughout the 1950s. They took up arms and in their struggle killed a number of civilians. And the British response was fierce. They bombed Kenyan towns and cities where they believed the Mau Mau lived. They interned over 1 million Kenyans in barbed wire villages where food and water was limited and where movement was heavily restricted. And over 100,000 people suspected of being part of the Mau Mau were rounded up and put in concentration camps. This is a former detainee who had been a member of the Kenya Africa Union, so an organisation that wasn't the Mau Mau, describing his experience.
Twagithie hora twaikara kuu hora twaikarire kiugu tugikara handu ta hatha ija gutari kuhingure turi thiini wa kambi tukimenya kuri rĩu tuonire thigari ciaiyũrio nja thigari nyingĩ mũno ikĩiyũra kuma hau tũkĩhingũrĩrwo ithuothe twakĩhingũrwo tũgĩthiĩ tũkĩrutwo nja ya kiugu ya kambi twarutwo nja tũgĩkora thigari ciĩharĩirie niĩ naniĩ mwene kuma hau rĩu ciahũragwo niĩ naniĩ nĩndaringirwo ndaringwo ona ndiacokire kwĩigua.
In their repression of the Mau Mau uprising, the British killed over 11,000 people, the vast majority of them not involved in armed resistance. And it was all in the name of wiping out what they called a terrorist group. This is how the uprising was covered in British newsreels at the time.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya. Troops are in the streets of Nairobi. Sir Evelyn Baring, the governor, salutes the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers who have flown in to help clear his colony of the Mau Mau menace, which has struck fear into Kenya's very heart. A black cloud of suspicion hangs over all in Kenya, and until the Mau Mau are destroyed, the innocent too must suffer.
So we're presented with a terrorist group committed to a reign of terror. Of course, there is no mention of why they might have been fighting or why occupation and colonialism might be at the root of this. And the British journalist at the end there tells us, until the terrorists are destroyed, the innocent must inevitably suffer. The innocent must inevitably suffer. Aaron, we like to think we've moved on from media coverage like this, but can you think of any contemporary parallels? Any other examples where we've got people dismissed as terrorists and people justifying the collective punishment of a civilian population until that terrorist group, or so-called terrorist group, is destroyed?
Just a few, Michael. Just a few. And also, with regards to Mau Mau in Kenya, there were also a few conservative, or rather a few Labour MPs who led the national debate in terms of the truth of the matter. Barbara Castle went to Kenya. She said what is happening there is awful. She compared it to the Gestapo under the Third Reich. That was what Barbara Castle did. You might not agree or disagree, but that's what she did. And she highlighted appalling atrocities there. We don't know how many people died. There's a great book by Caroline Elkins. I've got it written here. Britain's Gulag, which was the most recent, that was the first book she did. Legacy of Violence, which came out in 2022. Massive book. I read it a couple of years ago. I think I probably read it before it came out. I read like a proof version because you get to do that when you're, a journalist. It's a really long book, 600-700 pages. Fantastic book, amazing book. I read the first one, which I think came out in 2005-06, and then that one. She's a Harvard academic, hugely impressive historian. And I think if you're interested in Kenya, what happened, Caroline Elkins is the place to start. So that's the first parallel, Michael, with what we have today, is that we have certain Labour MPs who say things which are not really very savoury. Shouldn't be saying that in polite society. We don't look at them like that now, do we? And I suspect the same will hold true for dissenting MPs who criticise, for instance, Israeli security policy and its judgments in the last month. I think in 70, 80 years, those calling it out will be viewed in a certain way. Of course, that's for history to decide, not me. And then in terms of the sheer numbers, we don't know how many died, but it was a lot. It really was a lot. I mean, Elkins puts the numbers at, hundreds of thousands. But of course, this was effectively a form of civil war as well. So you can't lay that entirely at the hands of the British in so much as people were also acting on their behalf. But it was a really appalling time. Around the same time as that, of course, you've got Malaya, what was called the emergency, the Malaya emergency. Very similar tactics. You have huge numbers of people, most of the civilian population in Malaya, put into concentration camps. They were forcibly resettled. And also you have the use of, I believe, Agent Orange, and maybe napalm, which of course the US then deploys in Vietnam, because they look at what the Brits do so successfully in Malaya. You're fighting in a jungle, counterinsurgency warfare, guerrilla warfare tactics. This is what the Brits do. We're going to do the same in Vietnam. So it wasn't that long ago, Michael, that we were doing some pretty abysmal things. I know people like to say, well, the British Empire was a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, this is literally the British Empire. You can at least go to the end of the Second World War. But many people like to think that the worst excesses of British imperialism are 100, 150 years old. Of course, to an extent, that's true. But some pretty barbaric stuff was still happening in living memory. We're talking the mid-1950s here. There are many people out there who were alive, or their parents were alive then. And that's the political context we're in. And I think that's actually supremely useful when thinking about ongoing events, like the illegal war of Iraq, for instance, or what's going on right now in Palestine and Gaza. This is a very useful context. So, like I say, Caroline Elkins, very formidable writer. I'd love to interview her one day on Novara to talk about precisely this.
I want to go a bit more into sort of the present parallel, because obviously sort of reading about this and watching the videos about how this was covered at the time, it reminded me of how the Western press is talking about Israel, Palestine, and Hamas, right? They are saying essentially, Hamas, whatever you think of their tactics, you have to recognize that they came out of a particular context of occupation, of injustice, right? That doesn't justify killing grandmas and children, right? But you can't explain what happened on October the 7th without giving that context. And that's exactly how the Mau Mau were covered. They were just this group of irrational, bloodthirsty, barbaric terrorists who had to be destroyed. No reference to the context at all. I look through, there's quite a lot of past footage about this, about the Mau Mau on YouTube. It is very interesting to watch, to sort of see the parallels and how this was talked about. Then at the end of that clip that we showed you, you had someone saying, to destroy the Mau Mau, we don't like to do it. We don't want to make life miserable for Kenyan civilians, but it's not us. It's not us that are responsible for this. The responsibility lies with the Mau Mau. And until the Mau Mau are all rooted out and found, generally an impossible thing to do, by the way, if people are part of a popular struggle, until they're completely destroyed, what we are going to have to do is make ordinary Kenyans suffer. And that's exactly what we've heard about here. And, when we talk about in the past, right, it's common sense. King Charles will say, well, of course, that was collective punishment. Of course, we shouldn't have done that. When it comes to a situation right now, the media is exactly the same in 2023 as it was in the 1950s. Oh, no, this isn't collective punishment. It's ridiculous to call this collective punishment. What this is Israel, who are, they're good people, they're a good country, like us, civilized people. They are trying to root out an awful terrorist group. And if those terrorist groups hide out among ordinary people, it's not our fault if we end up killing a load of civilians in the process. That's the terrorist's fault for hiding among the people. Every resistance group ever, anywhere, do I even want to use the word hides? But stays among the people. They're often of the people. But also in a situation of asymmetrical warfare, you are generally going to hide out in civilian areas, because if you have a big bunker and call it, this is our Ministry of Defense, and you're up against an army which is 1,000 times stronger than you, that Ministry of Defense, which you've just sort of put a sign up on top of, isn't going to last very long, is it? So in a situation of asymmetric warfare, when you've got a colonized people fighting back against a colonizer, that's how they behave. And when we look at this in the past, we can be adults about this. We can say, oh, were the Mau Mau terrorists or were they freedom fighters? It's actually up for debate, but it's not as if the historiography says, oh, history has proven the Mau Mau right, because there's a debate about whether the Mau Mau actually sped up the process of decolonization or whether they slowed it down. It's not exactly the same situation as sort of the ANC, where it was the ANC who ultimately became the government after the British left, or after an apartheid colonial system ended. The Mau Mau were sort of, you could call them the radical flank of the fight against colonialism, and potentially, some of the tactics people who are against colonialism might still want to condemn. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly urgent to do that, but we can have a sensible conversation about were those tactics right. And obviously, we have to always have as the big meta story the reason the reason any of this is happening, the reason any of these difficult tactical decisions have to be made by colonized people, is because there is an imperial occupier there. Right, so you're failing to see the wood from the trees if you're just saying, well, the Mau Mau are terrorists. But if the Mau Mau, if this situation was right now, right, you'd have someone of Kenyan background or whoever. They go on the BBC. First question: do you condemn the Mau Mau? Right? They wouldn't be asking them about the concentration camps that, in this case, 100,000 people were put in and tortured. They wouldn't be asking you about the million or so people who were in barbed wire villages, their movement restrained. By the way, the justification for restraining their movement was also exactly the same as the justification for putting Gaza under siege. Oh, if we let them move around freely, they'd just do terrorist attacks. Right? That's what we say about Gaza. But if these people, if the Kenyans in the 1950s, or if this situation was right now, the Kenyans would be going on BBC and say, do you condemn the Mau Mau? And then that would be the whole conversation. 10 minutes wasted. Do you condemn the Mau Mau? Aaron, do you think I'm overstating the similarities here?
No, I think that's exactly what would happen. That's literally exactly. Can you imagine if we had Twitter in the 1920s, when you had the various boycotts by Indians to get rid of British colonialism? Do you condemn this? Oh, this is bad. Oh God, these boycotts by Indians of various British businesses, that's bad. Don't you know you're putting little Timmy out of his father, this imperial diplomat and business owner? His children can't go to Harrow. Haven't you thought about that? That's the kind of stuff we would have. When we have the rail strikes in this country, Michael, last winter, BBC Online. Here are the 3 people who couldn't go to a Britney Spears concert. That's the kind of stuff you would see. What you have to understand, Michael, is that something I have grasped as I've gotten older is very few people actually believe in the wider principle of liberty, freedom for everyone. Very few people. Not very few people. It's not the majority. They believe in it for themselves, which of course is why you get liberal democratic government, you get trade unions, you get all sorts of things, because people are really interested in advancing their own interests. But when it comes to other people, it's unusual. It's unusual to think, well, actually, that person over there deserves the same thing I have over here, and which I take for granted. It's very unusual. So no, I don't think you're overstating the case, Michael. But isn't it interesting how many Brits, and I certainly didn't learn this at school, I talked about what happened in Kenya. I talked about what happened in Malaya in the 20th century because it's so recent. Or even Britain's administration of the Palestine Mandate. You know, we lost hundreds of people in what was Palestine. Most of them were killed by Zionist terrorists. You know, nobody knows this. The King David Hotel bombing. Nobody knows this. One of the biggest ever terrorist atrocities against British service personnel ever was done by people who would go on to play central roles in the Israeli government after the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. Nobody knows this. Nobody knows this. Terrorists can only be around people with kafirs. So, yeah, I think history is a very powerful thing when you know it. And, you know, maybe we should have a history podcast here at Novara Media, Michael. You know, we've got Novara FM, which is very good. Maybe we need just history, the right history, the good history, to counteract all the nonsense you get in legacy media, which, just to finish, Michael, you're not being informed of anything. You're watching TV, you're watching GB News, BBC, Sky. Who's learning anything when you have the anchor hectoring the guests for 20 minutes? Will you condemn? Will you apologize? You know, I go on, I'll happily condemn Hamas. Of course I will. Of course I will. I'll also condemn the Israeli government, which is allowing for illegal settlements to happen every day for 30 years since the Oslo Accords. I'll also condemn them. You don't want me to do that. That's not part of the game. The game here is you just condemn these people. And if you don't, you're a bad person, and that's then the story. What I think or don't think is not important. What is important is that we have 2.5 million people living in an open-air prison. We have 200 Israeli hostages, which ideally are liberated. And we have a settlement in Israel, Palestine, which is awful and is only going in one direction. That's the story, but no. Broadcast journalists are obsessed with, will you condemn? Will you condone? Why are you a bad person? They don't tell us what to think, Michael. This is the worst part. They don't tell us what to think. They tell us what to feel. And if you don't feel how you're meant to feel, then they get very angry and they demonize and ostracize. And we know that full well here at Novara Media. We know very well how it works firsthand. And look, that's only ever meant we redouble our efforts at building something better right here at Novara Media.